The alien military stronghold loomed over the barren landscape, a cold, brutalist structure of blackened steel and reinforced plating. The walls were lined with mounted plasma cannons, their barrels still glowing faintly from recent engagements. Inside, the air was sterile, the scent of burnt ozone lingering from energy weapons that had been fired too many times. The prisoner processing chamber was deathly silent except for the sound of dragging footsteps. Two heavily armored Zelvari soldiers hauled a human across the cold metal floor. His body was bruised, his breathing shallow, his once pristine uniform now torn and blood-stained. His wrists were bound behind his back, deep red indentations marking his skin where the restraints had bitten in. The officers watching from the command deck looked on with mild disinterest. They had seen this before. "Put him here," barked Commander Vorzal, the high-ranking execution overseer. His voice was sharp, impatient. The soldiers obeyed, throwing the human forward. He collapsed onto his knees, head bowed, arms restrained. Weak, defeated. As he lifted his head, his one unbloodied eye flicked upward, taking in the half-circle of Zelvari soldiers standing before him. Their weapons were raised, standard procedure. The execution squad. 5 soldiers. 5 rifles, preloaded with high-velocity plasma rounds. Vorzal stepped forward, looking down at the human with a mixture of disgust and amusement. "Pathetic," he muttered. The other officers nodded. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't even justice. This was cleanup. "Human," Vorzal continued, his voice condescending. "Your kind always talks about your resilience. Your endurance. That nonsense about never giving up." He leaned down slightly, his scaled face inches from the prisoners. "Let's see if that holds true when you're dead." The human said nothing. He simply exhaled, slow and measured. That annoyed Vorzal. Execution squad, ready. The 5 soldiers took position, aiming their rifles at the prisoner's chest. Fire. The chamber filled with the deafening sound of plasma discharges. 5 shots. Perfectly placed. The human's body jerked violently as the rounds slammed into his chest, one after another. For half a second, his body remained upright, as if his muscles refused to acknowledge death. Then, finally, he collapsed, face first, unmoving. A pool of deep red spread beneath him, the metallic scent of blood mixing with burnt fabric and cauterized wounds. Silence. Then, "Confirm the kill," Vorzal ordered, turning away. "Dispose of the corpse." The execution squad lowered their rifles. It was over, or so they thought. The plasma burns were still glowing, faint embers seared into flesh. Smoke curled from the wounds, the execution shots precise, deadly, final. The human wasn't moving. Vorzal didn't bother looking back. "Clean it up," he muttered, waving a clawed hand dismissively as he turned toward the command deck. The execution squad stepped forward. It was standard procedure. They'd confirm the kill, haul the lifeless body to the disposal bay, and within an hour, there would be nothing left but a report. Nothing left of the human. The first soldier crouched, reaching out to check for any lingering biosigns. Then froze. His breath caught, his frills pulsing in alarm. "What is it?" another soldier barked. No answer. Just silence. The soldier's eyes were locked onto the human's hand. A twitch. A small one. Barely noticeable. But it had moved. "Did you see that?" His voice was quieter now, uncertain. The second soldier let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Relax. It's just a nerve reaction. Their species does that sometimes." The first soldier hesitated. "No, I." Then, the body shifted. Not a spasm. Not a reflex. A deliberate movement. Slow. Controlled. Like something waking up. "Tage, that's impossible," the first soldier whispered, stepping back. The laughter died instantly. They watched in frozen horror as the human's fingers curled slightly, pressing against the bloodied floor. His chest rose. A breath. Deep. Strained. The burns on his body should have been lethal. The blood loss should have been fatal. He should have been dead. But now, he was moving. The squad leader staggered backward, his rifle raising instinctively. "Sir," he called toward Vorzal, voice sharp with fear. The commander turned, annoyed. What now? The soldiers weren't listening. They were watching. Because the human was pushing himself off the ground. Not fast. Not suddenly. Just rising. As if the execution had been an inconvenience. As if dying had been a suggestion. Vorzal's blood ran cold. Because the human wasn't just moving. He was looking at them. His eyes weren't lifeless. They were focused, calculating, alive, and worst of all, he was smiling. The execution chamber had gone deathly silent. The Zelvari soldiers stared, rifles trembling in their hands. The human should be dead. There was no logical reason for him to be standing. No biological reason for him to still be breathing. Yet, he was. And worse, he was moving. His body was broken, burned, bleeding. Plasma scorches riddled his chest, his uniform torn, stained with deep streaks of red. His breathing was ragged, each inhale sounding like it should be his last. But it wasn't. He took another step forward. A slow, unsteady step. But a step. And suddenly, panic set in. "Shoot him again," one of the soldiers shouted, voice cracking. The first shot slammed into his shoulder. His body jerked. He stumbled, but did not fall. A second shot hit his side. A third. A fourth. Each impact should have sent him crashing to the floor. Each round should have ended this nightmare. But it didn't. The human didn't stop. His muscles tensed against the pain, against the force of each plasma round. He should be unconscious. He should be dead. Yet, his legs kept moving. "Why won't he fall?" one of the Zelvari stammered, voice high with terror. Another soldier let out a frantic snarl. "He's bluffing. He's faking it. Shoot him." Plasma fire erupted in the chamber. Dozens of rounds, burning holes into his arms, his chest, his legs. The force knocked him backward, slamming him against the steel wall. Dust and smoke filled the air. No way he could have survived that. No way. The Zelvari squad stood frozen, rifles still aimed, waiting. Waiting for the human to stop moving. Waiting for the body to slump. Waiting for this nightmare to end. And then, through the dust, a shadow shifted. A figure stepped forward. Slowly, steadily. The human, still standing, still moving. Blood dripped from his wounds, soaking the floor beneath him. His body was wrecked, torn apart by gunfire. But he did not fall. His breath was slow, controlled, unbroken. His eyes locked onto them. Focused, calculating, like a predator watching prey. This isn't possible," one of the soldiers whispered. What are you?" another choked out, stepping back in terror. The human exhaled. Then, he smiled. And in that moment, the aliens realized they weren't fighting a man. They were fighting something else. Something that refused to die. The execution chamber had descended into chaos. Alien warriors, *** elite Zelvari soldiers, trained to crush rebellions, to burn entire worlds, *** stood paralyzed with their rifles still aimed. And yet, none of them fired. Because they had already fired. Dozens of times. And the human was still standing. Commander Vorzal's blood ran cold as he watched the impossible unfold before him. The human's body should have failed. The wounds, the blood loss, the sheer trauma. Nothing in the galaxy could endure this. And yet, the human took another step forward. His legs shook. His breath was ragged, shallow. His uniform was burned and soaked in red. But he did not fall. And then, he grinned. A slow, bloody, impossible grin. "See, Commander, what do we do?" one of the soldiers stammered. Vorzal didn't answer. His mind was screaming, scrambling for logic. "This is wrong," he growled under his breath. "This isn't natural. This isn't possible." And yet, here he was, still moving, still breathing. The soldiers weren't just afraid anymore. They were terrified. A primal fear. A fear of something that cannot be killed. "He's a trickster," one of the officers choked out. "A mutation. A genetic anomaly." "Enough," Vorzal roared. His mind snapped back into control, gripping onto one last shred of authority. "This thing is not unstoppable. Bring out the cannons," he snarled. "Burn him to nothing." The Zelvari warriors scrambled to obey. Heavy plasma turrets lowered from the ceiling, their barrels locking onto the human. Heat radiated off their cores, primed for vaporization-level firepower. Target locked. Fire. A thunderous explosion erupted from the cannons, a wall of blazing white-hot energy engulfing the human in a storm of destruction. The entire chamber shook. Smoke billowed into the air. The floor beneath the blast glowed red-hot, molten. Nothing could survive that. Nothing. For a moment, the Zelvari allowed themselves to believe it was over. Then the dust cleared, and the human was still there. Burned, bloodied, but still standing. His breathing was heavier now. His hands clenched into fists. His eyes alive. Focused. And worst of all, he was still smiling. The Zelvari staggered back, their tails coiling in pure, primal horror. That's not possible, one soldier whispered. What? What are you? Another choked. The human tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, he took another step forward. His voice was hoarse, but steady. I don't stop. He wiped the blood from his lip, his eyes burning like embers. Not until the job is done. And in that moment, Vorzal finally understood. The plasma rounds, the cannon fire, the impossible endurance. None of that was the real weapon. It was his mind, his will, his refusal to die. And that was what truly terrified them. The Zelvari stronghold was no longer a place of control. It was a tomb. The human should not have been alive. And yet, he was. Commander Vorzal's claws trembled as he gripped his plasma pistol. His soldiers were paralyzed, their weapons still aimed, but no one fired. Because it didn't matter anymore. Nothing had worked. They had shot him. He kept moving. They had burned him. He kept moving. They had vaporized the very ground beneath his feet. And still, he kept moving. This isn't real, one of the officers whispered. He should be dead. The human took another step. A soldier panicked. He screamed, unloading another barrage of plasma fire straight into the human's chest. Shot after shot after shot. Each round hit. Each round burned. Each round failed. The human's body jerked from the impacts. His breath hitched. His steps faltered. But he did not fall. The alien soldier dropped his weapon, his mind breaking. Why won't you die? He shrieked. The human didn't answer. He simply kept walking, straight into the group of soldiers. They turned to run, but it was already too late. The human moved through them like a force of nature. A soldier tried to raise his rifle. A broken arm was all he got in return. Another swung a blade, a shattered wrist, and a scream. One fell to the floor, curling into himself, whispering prayers to the stars. The fear had consumed them now, and the human knew it. His voice was low, hoarse, deadly. You thought I'd stop, because you hurt me? Vorzal staggered backward, horror twisting through his chest. The soldiers were broken. Their training? Useless. Their weapons? Pointless. Their confidence? Gone. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a massacre. The last shot rang out. Only Vorzal remained. Alone, breathing heavily, staring into the eyes of something that should not exist. A being that defied logic. A being that refused to die. A being that was unstoppable. The human exhaled, blood dripping from his mouth. You made a mistake, Commander. Vorzal's hands shook violently as he raised his pistol. The human tilted his head. You thought I needed a reason to keep moving. And then, he stepped forward one last time. Commander Vorzal couldn't breathe. His claws trembled around the grip of his pistol. His legs refused to move. The execution chamber, once filled with elite warriors, now lay silent. His soldiers, the best of the Zelvari military, were gone. Some had tried to fight. They failed. Some had tried to run. They didn't get far. And now, only he remained. His breathing was shallow, heart pounding in his chest, his mind still struggling to understand what he had just witnessed. The human should not be alive. But he was, standing there, bleeding, burned, broken, and still moving, still standing, still watching him. Unstoppable. What are you? Vorzal rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. The human tilted his head slightly, considering him. You already know, he said quietly. He took one last step forward. And Vorzal felt his soul shatter. His pistol slipped from his fingers. He had lost. Not just this fight. Not just his men. He had lost everything. Because now he understood. Humans don't stop. They don't surrender. They don't break the way the rest of the galaxy expects them to. And worst of all, they don't die the way they should. The human turned away, stepping through the blood-streaked chamber, his form disappearing into the shadows. Vorzal didn't dare follow, didn't dare move. Because he knew, somewhere, somehow, this wasn't over. Not for him. Not for the Zelvari. Not for the galaxy. The last thing he heard before the human vanished was a single whisper, a truth that would haunt him forever. We keep moving. Then, silence. Nothing remained except the smell of blood, the ruins of his fallen warriors, and the fear left behind.